All right, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. We're just going to let everything pump through the fiber optics of the world till everybody is live, locked, and listening, and then we'll get started. I'm even going to hit another button here, and we will be ready to go soon. All right, so good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are super stoked to have an old friend, Chip Conley, join us for a discussion about the pitfalls and potentials of transformational leadership. And if you don't already know Chip, I'm going to give a quick introduction. He's a hell of a fella. So Chip started at Stanford Business School, and I think I remember this from way back when. Didn't you like room with or were in the same class with Seth Godin? Is that right? There was somebody, there's some other interesting person that was a cohort of yours.
Seth Godin and I were in business school together, and we wrote a book together in business school.
Fantastic. Yeah, exactly. So that was the sort of storied kickoff. And then by the age of 25 or 26, Chip founded Joie de Vivre Hotels, one of the preeminent boutique hotel chains. So if you've ever been to a Kimpton or now the Standard and any of the other kind of hip swanky hotels, if you've seen Portlandia and seen their funny skits, Chip was really there at ground zero, taking rock and roll chic and turning it into the lived experience. So, the exact antithesis of Marriott's and Hilton's. Chip was on the sharp end of that way back when. Steered that for a quarter century, and then successfully sold that, and then became an advisor to the next generation of innovative hospitality when three young whippersnappers who had started Airbnb and didn't quite know what to do with the giant truck that they had caught, turned to Chip for some advice.
More of a rocket ship.
Ridiculous. And Chip helped guide that through its years of exceptional, outstanding growth to the point where it has now become a verb, like Ubering a car or hoovering your house. And Chip is also the prolific author and speaker. He speaks to Fortune 100 audiences all around the world. He's spoken at TED, all kinds of very significant and high impact gatherings of people who, literally make policy decisions, make market decisions to shape the world. And most recently, and including actually the book Peak, which is where our paths originally crossed, which is all about flow states and how to bring flow states into companies and organizations you lead. He's also written Rebel Rules and Motional Equations, and this year, in fact, coming out as early fall, is his new book, Wisdom at Work: The Making of a Modern Elder. So please join me in welcoming Chip Conley. Dude, stoked to have you, and really fired up to have this conversation.
I'm honored to be here with you, and we're both in the state of Texas, which is interesting.
We are with triple digit temps and more humidity than either of us would care for, I'm sure. So what I'd love to do, and for everybody that's tuning in, what I'd love to be able to do is basically just tee up, because the reason we reached out to Chip and said, hey mate, I think you're probably one of the best people on the planet to have this conversation with, is noodling on the question that many of us may have faced from time to time, which is, as we seek personal development, as we seek transformative experiences, for anybody that's read Stealing Fire and is familiar with that working concept of ecstasis, or those moments where we step outside ourselves, they're all fine and good. In fact, they're kind of awesome. And the son of a bitch is often bringing them back home. The son of a bitch is how well do we do translating that transformation into our lives and work. And I'm not sure if there literally is another person who has both sort of thought as thoughtfully about it and at the same time done as much with it as Chip here. So quick, I just want to get some folks' thoughts. Let's just drop our first question. Let's see where you guys are as our audience. If you look on the right-hand side, there will be a quick dynamic poll, which is, what has it been like for you? Because this is really the theme that we're kind of working on, which is, have you ever struggled with having some mountaintop experience and then being like hair on fire, like everything makes sense, or I know what I'm going to do Monday morning, or we've got to change the way our family works, or our relationship works, or our company or business or product works, whatever it is, and you come back and you run into some form of a brick wall. The clarity, the excitement that you had doesn't necessarily translate to the folks you bring it back to. So let's just quick seeing. We've got 15% saying somewhat, a bit, 16%, but a hell yes is an overwhelming 75% of us. So it's 3/4 of us. And, you know, I would imagine, Chip, that we would both be in the hell yes category, have experienced some challenge or struggle with exactly that, the impossible art of translating transformation. So Chip, I just want to let's hear a little bit of your story. First of all, how did you go from Stanford MBA, which could have been a very cut and dried experience, to doing the things you've done, including being on the board of the Esalen Institute, which we wrote about in Stealing Fire, the storied kind of center of the human potential movement on the Big Sur coast, and also even the Burning Man organization, which is really host to the wildest ass transformational gathering on the planet. How did you go from B school to that?
Well, the truth is, I was one of those closet ecstatics that you talked about. That in business school, that was not my tribe, and I liked the people I went to business school with, but I constantly felt like there were a variety of subjects that I couldn't talk about, and so it was really in my mid-20s. I was Seth Godin and I were the two youngest members of our Stanford Business School class.
That's great.
Both of us rebels, and it was in my mid-20s I started to realize that I think the things that I was going to be best at, just like Seth, were not going to be the traditional MBA kind of activities, and I was a real estate developer out of business school, commercial real estate developer, but I wanted to do something more creative. I had a small apartment in the Telegraph Hill area on Filbert Steps, and I kept having people come and stay with me and sleep on my couch. This is before couch surfing existed as lingo or a company. And I would do my focus group of one and say, why are you staying with me as opposed to in a hotel? And I kept hearing the hotels in San Francisco were either boring or expensive. And this was the mid-1980s. Boutique hotels were just getting off the ground. Long story short is, one thing I learned from Richard Branson, who's been a bit of a mentor at times in my life, is if you're going to start a business, the mantra you need to say to yourself over and over again is, I am the market, I am the market, I am the market. So create a product you're going to fall in love with. And that's really what my premise was. At age 26, I bought an old, broken down, pay-by-the-hour motel in the Tenderloin of San Francisco.
No UV lights for that one, huh?
No, the corporate, our biggest corporate account was Vinny and his girls. So we definitely worked by the hour. And that place, the Phoenix, 31 and a half years later now, continues to be one of the best known rock and roll hotels or motels in the world. And that was the first of 52 boutique hotels I created. But I think one of the things from a transformational perspective that really worked for me is I stuck my neck out and I said, you know what, I want the company name to be the company mission as well. And so I called the company Joie de Vivre. It's not a practical name for a company because it's hard to spell.
Not in America.
Not in America, hard to pronounce. Not here in Texas, that's for sure. Hard to pronounce, hard to spell. Most people don't know what it means, but it means joy of life. And the fact that we were creating a company whose mission was joy, it was in the language of the company, and everybody who joined the company, and literally, hopefully, everybody who actually stayed in one of our hotels figured that out. We also did a branding no-no, which was every single one of our 52 boutique hotels had a different name. There was an umbrella brand of Joie de Vivre, but everything from the Hotel Vitale on the waterfront of San Francisco on the Embarcadero, which is an upscale luxury hotel. So we had down in Big Sur, Ventana for about 10 or 12 years, a great, beautiful old rustic place across the street from Post Ranch Inn. So each one had its own brand, and then there was the bigger brand. But I think the transformational element of this was the idea that we were creating a company that was striving to create joy, first and foremost for our employees, and then secondly for our customers, and third for our investors. And ultimately, that's what led me to writing Peak, which I can talk about in a couple minutes, which was a model that was based upon transformation.
Well, actually, I mean, I was super curious about that because if I remember correctly, you were talking about the application of Peak during a market downturn. Like it really wasn't just like fluffy bunnies and razor scooters and Xboxes for everyone, right? It wasn't just kind of like Silicon Valley excess. You had to eat your dog food in some really tough times. Tell us about that, because for me, I'm a huge fan. I'm a sort of, what would you call it? Like a Gnostic Stoic. So I'm all about the peak experience, but it's also like, suck it up, fat kid, do the hard thing.
Exactly. Yeah. It's both. I started the company in '87. We had an earthquake in '89, so I got that experience in San Francisco. And then we, had 5 or 6 years of just okay times. And then we had the dot-com boom, the last half of the '90s. And I had the largest hotel company, actually the largest hotel company in the Bay Area, and one of the largest boutique hotel companies in the country at that point. We had 21 boutique hotels all around the San Francisco Bay Area. And then we had the dot-com crash starting in 2001. And then we had 9/11 and you name it. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, including the fact my company was named Joie de Vivre. And at that point, there were people in the U.S. who were boycotting French companies because if you recall back in the Iraq War, we didn't like French companies because those Frenchies didn't like the fact we went to war with the Iraqis. And I would get these letters from Alabama and maybe even Houston, where I am right now, saying, you know what, we hate you because, you're a French company. And I would write back and I'd say, this is before, well, I guess we had email at that point. I'd write back and I'd say, you know what, we're not a French company, we're an American company based in San Francisco. And they'd write back and say, San Francisco? ? Oh, that's worse. Long story short is, in that difficult time with all of our 21 hotels in the worst hotel market in the country in terms of year-over-year revenue drop between 2001 and 2005, what I found is I needed a leadership and an organizational framework that could lead to transformation. What tends to happen in bad times is people go into the survival mode. And I could see that in my own company. And if you have a company that's called Joie de Vivre and everybody's in a survival mode, it creates some serious cognitive dissonance, and people are confused by it. And so one day, about a year into the downturn, I was in a local bookstore that's no longer there. It was a Borders bookstore in Union Square in San Francisco. And I went there looking for a business book, and I came across, I was in the business section for 5 minutes. I said, my problems are more serious than that. So I went to the self-help and psychology section. And I came across a book by Abraham Maslow. Now, Abraham Maslow, everybody, probably heard of him, The Hierarchy of Needs. I only took one psychology class in college, but I did remember Maslow. He was the good guy. He was the one who sort of focused on best practices in human behavior as opposed to worst practices. Yeah. And I took that 5-level pyramid and I said, there's 3 premises in how we live our lives. It's 3 paradigms. It's either survival, which is the first 2 levels of Maslow's pyramid, which are physiological and safety needs, or it's success, which are levels 3 and 4 of Maslow's pyramid, which are the social and belonging piece on 3rd and 4th levels of esteem. And then at the top is transformation, which is translates to self-actualization. So think of a pyramid. I call it the transformation pyramid of survival at the base, success in the middle, and transformation at the top. And then we apply it to our 3 most important constituencies: employees, customers, and investors.
And how did that work for you? Because I've got a couple of examples of other well-known leaders of large companies we'll get to in a second that have tried similar things, and they've had spectacular successes and collateral damage from trying this thing. So what was it like for you to have had that experience? You were in the bookstore, you're like, okay, I'm going to try this. And then you try rolling it out. And I mean, what's the balance between church and state, getting up in people's lives and businesses, asking them to transform, but they want a paycheck and there's HR. How did you navigate?
Yeah. No, Tony Shea and I've compared notes. Yeah. What he's tried to do at Zappos. I think the good news is when people join a company called Joie de Vivre, and the basic premise of the company is we're all about joy, the idea that we're trying to get people out of the survival mode wasn't as difficult as it might be in a different company. So the culture was there's already an acculturation around the idea of how do we get to joy. But we had to have a framework. And so ultimately we had to have our leaders, when I sold the company, we had 3,500 employees, but back then at that time we had about 1,200 employees. And so the key was to make sure first of all, about 150 leaders in the company understood this model. So the way the model worked, I'll give you one example, the employee pyramid. So if it's survival, succeed, transform, applying that to employees is money at the base of the pyramid or compensation package, recognition in the middle, and meaning at the top. And so we developed this model for how our leaders could operate with that employee hierarchy of needs pyramid of money, recognition, meaning. And what we realized, for example, is that we just needed, the first thing we needed to do is with all of the hotel companies in the Bay Area doing layoffs, we chose to be the only hotel company in the Bay Area that didn't do layoffs. But we had to make a lot of other difficult choices if we weren't going to do layoffs. But I felt like if we were going to do economic layoffs, not because people have done anything wrong, but just because we don't have the business, I didn't like that idea because I felt it would create an anxiety. Like, when's the next round of layoffs? So I pretty much made a commitment we wouldn't be doing economic layoffs. But we did a bunch of other things to save money, and we did a bunch of other things to create new sort of perks that didn't cost the company any money, but they were really valuable to our employees. And that's
give us a few examples of those. Like, so because for instance, like as you say that, I'm like, okay, that sounds awesome. But well, who was your board that let you do that and didn't insist that you just cut the fat? And then also B, how did you balance the books in a tough time?
Well, the situation was even more dire, and that is that we are a management company managing hotels for owners. Now, in about 40% of the cases, we were an owner as well, but in every case, a minority owner. So we were not a majority owner. So I had to convince 21 hotels owners, of which 60% we didn't have any ownership interest, that the strategy was going to work for them. So it was not just convincing our leaders or my board of the management company, but it was literally convincing owners who were in their own survival mode and wanted to basically cut, and slash everything. So we just said, okay, instead of actually firing housekeepers and bellmen and having general managers of hotels be on the night audit, doing the night shift. Instead, let's do the following collection of things. Let's do a 10% pay cut for anybody who's salaried and 20% pay cut for more senior people. Because frankly, those people can actually still survive. And a 10% pay cut for somebody, making 5 times as much money as somebody who's a line level hourly worker is meaningful. I mean, and so that was one thing we did. We also dramatically changed our health benefit package. So nobody lost any health benefits, but we actually moved everybody over to Kaiser, which was an HMO that was at that time, it's different today, but at that time it was about 30% less expensive than the PPOs. And yes, some people had to leave their original doctor, but they didn't. They actually they could pay up if they wanted to do that. So that was another thing we did. But the biggest thing we did is we actually incorporated our local hoteliers, restaurateurs, and spa people, and we said, tell us what we can do to save money. We actually just sort of put it to them and said, listen, you control your own destiny. Tell us how we can save money. And we got millions of dollars of savings from our line level employees because they knew, frankly, their job might count on it. So, it's just an obvious thing to do, but not a lot of people do that.
Phenomenal. And then give us the happy ending. So you doubled down and invested in your people and your culture at a time when everybody else was, dumping things overboard. How did that resolve? And then how did that get you to your exit?
Yeah. So I won't even go into it, but the recognition and the meaning piece were very important as well. Because those actually frankly, the thing that's interesting about the peak pyramid is what's at the base is a commodity, and the differentiation and loyalty with your employees, your customers, or investors all happens higher up the pyramid. But the story is, during that dot-com bust, when most of our competitors lost hotels, went bankrupt, went foreclosure, we tripled in size and revenues between 2001 and 2006. And that was against all odds, and we didn't lose any properties. And we just grew. We just kept growing. So we ended up growing into the second largest boutique hotel company in the U.S. All 52 of our hotels were based in California until right about the time I was selling the company. I sold the company to John Pritzker, whose family started the Hyatt chain. And I sold just the management company and the brand. The hotels that I still owned with partners, I didn't sell that real estate. So I still owned, when I sold the company, about 20 hotels. And today I still own 9. I've sold 11 of those hotels in the last 8 years. So that's so I would just say in terms of what's to be learned from transformational leadership on this, I think the best thing to be learned is like transformational leadership sounds like something people talk about when things are good, in good times. To be honest with you, transformational leadership in bad times has a more catalytic effect, because the difference in your company versus a transactional company is more noticeable. And this, and that language, transformational company versus a transactional company, is exactly the language I brought to my relationship with Brian Chesky at Airbnb, which I think you'll ask me about now.
Yeah, for sure. Before we jump to that, I want to ask you about some other folks, some other leaders, specifically Chip Wilson of Lululemon, Tony Hsieh of Zappos, and John Mackey of Whole Foods, right? All who have been broadly under the umbrella of kind of conscious capitalism, which was a movement that John Mackey co-founded, is one that you and I kind of have crossed paths within. But the idea of kind of people, profits, planets, whatever you'd want to say, but people thinking along these lines. And all three of those guys, Chip specifically, both sort of, infamously kind of flamed out with some of his less than tactful comments about his client population, et cetera. But he was also really well known for putting, I think, 50,000 employees through Landmark Forum and his efforts to bring in a transformational, language-based, raw, authentic, vulnerable culture to Lululemon, and ended up getting pushed out. Tony, for many of you that are listening, are probably familiar, and certainly if you read In Stealing Fire, put $350 million of his own into renovating downtown Las Vegas, and ran into some substantial and structural challenges doing that. John Mackey, who was here in Austin way back when in the late 80s, founded Whole Foods. It became a true market maker in organic food and produce around the world, and with the last 2 years was bought out, basically was dodging a hostile takeover from Janus Ventures, and ended up selling to Amazon. And even a good friend, mutual friend of ours, Chip, just led their strategic retreat, their first retreat, as they were sort of now under the Amazon world. And I think they were hopeful, but I think there's a lot of kind of being digested by the logistical Borg that is Amazon. And so, what's your comments on just that, sort of the rest of your colleagues and comrades playing this game at that level, and any sort of thoughts or kind of postmortems on what you see or lessons learned?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, I think that in 2 of those 3 cases, some of the wounds they've had have been self-inflicted. I think in Chip's case, it was his issue at Lululemon was less about Landmark. I've never been to Landmark, so I'm not somebody who's championing that. But I think it was more about some of his comments. And I think in John's case, frankly, some of his comments, he's I would say an extreme. Extreme's not the right word, but he's a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian. And so sometimes the things he says to a politically correct crowd around health care and a few other things are not what people expect out of the mouth of the founder and the CEO of Whole Foods. So I actually think both of them, frankly, had some of their problems around that. I do think that some of the issues around Whole Foods, their operation, and what led to some of the activist investing, is the sense that there was an opportunity there that wasn't being fully executed well. And I think Whole Foods has had some great operation. The idea of their teams, both them and Zappos, very team-based. I'd say the best of the 3 in terms of what their operating history has shown has been Zappos, and the fact that Amazon owns both Zappos and Whole Foods, but Amazon's left Tony pretty much on his own to run Zappos the way he does, partly because he's been so successful there. So I guess I would just say, as someone who is less high profile than the 3 of them, and I haven't shot myself in the foot with things I've said, or had a political, voice that was at odds with people. Bottom line is, I think that if you operate from the perspective of little ego, and that has been, the idea that you're a servant leader is, that's a term that came way before me, is, I think, really embedded in any of these successful transformational programs. It is not about the sage on the stage, so to speak. It's really, as someone who's a transformational leader, you are a shaman or a Sherpa. I mean, Sherpa is better than shaman. I think you're both, but you're more the Sherpa in the sense of helping lead people up the mountain. It's interesting I said shaman. I think it's just hanging out with you, Jamie, makes me think shaman. But I meant to say Sherpa, interestingly. And the Sherpa piece of it is, how is it that you are serving your people? Like the number one question I like to ask is a great transformational question, leadership question. At Airbnb or at Joie de Vivre, the question I would ask my direct reports is the following. What can I do to support you to do the best work of your life here at Joie de Vivre or at Airbnb? And the reason I love that is twofold. Number one is the obvious, which is if your boss is saying to you, what can I do to support you to do the best work of your life? You feel like your boss has your back. Your boss is not there to actually catch you doing something wrong. Your boss is actually there to help you to transform yourself and be successful. Great. But the second piece of that I really love is the fact your boss is asking you, what can I do as your boss to help support you to do the best work of your life, puts you in the position as the direct report to the boss to actually be proactive and not the victim or martyr complaining about your boss or the company. He or she, as your boss, is saying, tell me what you need to do great work. And frankly, what I found when I would ask that question, both at Airbnb and at Joie de Vivre, when someone was flummoxed or challenged by that question, it was a great indication to me that person was not taking responsibility or did not have the mindset to know what they needed to be successful.
Yeah, that's spot on. So quick question. In fact, let's just pause. I transition next over to some of the Airbnb story, but let's also just do a quick check-in with our audience. So let's drop the next question, which is just back to the theme of, what's your experience been of translating transformation, of taking your insights as a visionary person back to your relationships as a visionary leader, back to your organizations and teams, and actually get clear on which one's been harder. And sometimes it's, in fact, right now, you guys have answered, it's 100% professional. Now, okay, now the dials are shifting a little bit. Sometimes, you might get tons of support at home and figuring it out at work. You might work in an industry or a company with a specific culture that's really challenging. Other times, that's maybe the place that you feel most at home, and you can get back to kicking ass with a very dialed team. So actually, wow, this is fascinating to watch this. We're now at basically a dead heat of which is harder. Bringing back new insights, inspiration, personal growth, and developments, home or work. And it's about 50-50. In fact, it's spot on 50-50, which either means we're a bunch of ambivalent bastards, or that's just the way the cookie crumbles. So let's go with one more. Let's do one more quick question. And see what the follow-up to this one has been. We put in these questions before, so I'm as surprised as you guys as to what they're actually going to say. But let's see the next one. Oh yes. So if it's about 50-50 on relationships or life, personal life, and then professional work, the question here is, what is most helpful? What's been your success strategy? Chip was just been sharing quite a few of his in his articulation of Joie de Vivre. The first one is just shut up and be better, be different, like walk your talk. The next one is tell and communicate. Hey, I had this experience at band camp. It was really important. I have a girlfriend in the Niagara Falls region, whatever it would be. I'm going to share with you. Maybe I'll share with you photos. I'll tell you stories. I'll express what happened on my side of things. Or there's maybe third-party resources. And we've certainly had a lot of feedback over the last year or so, like Stealing Fire has become some version of that for some of you, in that sense of like, hey, you might not get this stuff, but read this. It validates and legitimates the experiences I've had. And then the final one would be just dragging their asses back up the mountain. You got to see this. And that's a frequent one as well. But clearly, I'm actually encouraged by this. Chip, I don't know. Can you see the poll results on the side here? Okay. So we're actually looking at half of us gathered here today are saying walk the talk, which I'm a big fan of, which is, in fact, when we coach executives, our general point is shut the fuck up for 6 months. And you will know you're ready to start teaching this or sharing this in your organization when people ask you, what on earth's happened? What's changed? So you guys are at 50% walking the talk, 33% sharing the personal experience, and then a kind of a dwindling tail, 10% sharing books or content, and 5 or 6% of actually getting to bring them or invite them into the experience, which if anybody has dealt with the sales machine that is the tag end of a landmark conference, you guys are in that camp. So that's fantastic. Okay, so that was our intermission. Now let's get back to Chip's story, multi-decades of how he has become truly a modern elder overseeing transformation. So let's jump into Brian and the crew at Airbnb. How did you even come into that role of senior strategic advisor for that company, which everybody knows, everybody uses? There's also this interesting symmetry, which I know you must have caught, which is that you said that the foundation of Joie de Vivre was people coming and staying on your couch and you going like, hey, the business opportunity here. And for you in the mid 80s, that business opportunity was making hotels and motels hip, fun, and functional. For these guys, fast forward into the early 2000s, same jam. They had people coming into their apartments to crash on their air mattresses. So pick up the story. Tell us how you guys came together and what was your experience trying to inject a little of that mojo there.
So I sold my company in 2010 and wasn't sure what was next. I started a festival website called Fest 300 because I was fascinated with collective effervescence. And I'm on, being on the board of Burning Man, but I decided I wanted to go to 36 festivals in 20 countries and understand why the more digital we get, the more ritual we need. So that's sort of a stealing fire moment, just in terms of what that was about. But that was more of a passion.
That's such a nice turn of phrase. Can you say that again?
Collective effervescence.
Yes, and the one after that, the more digital.
The more digital we get, the more ritual we need.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So, but I knew that was a passion project. In fact, I merged that company with a company called Everfest that's actually based in Austin. Long story short is I was not sure what was next. There's a beautiful quote from Robert De Niro in The Intern, the movie, where he says, musicians don't retire, they quit when there's no more music left inside of them. So I was 52 years old. And I knew I had music inside of me, but I wasn't sure I was supposed to share it with. And at exactly that time, I get this call from Brian Chesky, co-founder and CEO of Airbnb. Mind you, this is early 2013. Airbnb is a small tech startup. People are using it, but the core audience is at that point 90% millennial. The core audience is in a handful of countries, and it was a moderate sized company, and it was growing and it was getting on the radar, but it wasn't all that well known, frankly, in the hotel industry. I never used it, but also at that point, I didn't even have an Uber or Lyft app on my phone. So this was a time where, frankly, the sharing economy was language I didn't even know. So Brian approached me and said, we are a tech company with a design focus, but the third leg of the stool is hospitality, and we have 300 people in this company, and not one of us has any hospitality or travel industry background. You're based in San Francisco. We're based in San Francisco. Why don't you come and give a speech on hospitality innovation, and then let's talk more. And I'd like to have you mentor me, by the way. And so that's okay. I gave a talk. I started mentoring Brian. Next thing I knew, I was the head of global hospitality strategy. I was in charge of 7 other things, and I was supposed to be a 15-hour-a-week gig, and it became 15 hours a day. And what I learned from that experience, first of all, Brian loved my book Peak, and he loved the idea of the difference between transactional leaders versus transformational leaders. He said, Chip, I want to be a transformational leader. And I said, the number one thing you need to do to be a transformational leader is to create an organization that has a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. And Carol Dweck from Stanford has written a book called Mindset. And so I basically started that, and then I started having him read that, and then literally created the learning and development programs for the company as well. But bottom line is, I think what I learned in that time was I was a 52-year-old who'd never worked in a tech company before. And of course, I have something to offer by being a hospitality person, but my hospitality knowledge of how many maids does it take to clean a room in a boutique hotel was of no use to our Airbnb hosts. And so what I really had to do was search through what is it that I do know, and I had to edit a lot of what I didn't know. Plus, I was no longer the face of the company as I had been for 24 years in my own company. So I had to completely evolve. And I realized bottom line was that I was a mentor to Brian, but I was also an intern as well. And so I believe a modern elder, as opposed to a traditional elder, is as much of a student as they are a sage. And they have a curiosity and a beginner's mind and a willingness to go out and learn at the same time that they're teaching.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so much there. Now, how did you manage the sort of the ego and the pride of it? Like you've been an alpha. You just rode the rocket ship of your fucking hotel scene. I'm sure it was just absolutely like bumping times from the late 80s through the 90s. That must have been a wild ass ride, and you were a wunderkind. So how did you go from that to hanging out with millennials who may or may not have known or cared about those stories, and there you are balancing between the elder and the intern? What was that like on the inside?
I used to, starting a hotel company when you're 26, boy wonder, and then now modern elder. It was hard. I mean, there was a day that I was actually about 6 weeks into working there, and my father is 80 now, so this is 5.5 years ago. And he and I went for a hike. So he's a 74-and-a-half-year-old guy going on a hike with me. And he was actually ahead of me. I mean, I was really slow. I was, working ridiculous hours. But what he heard in me was fear. He heard the fear of somebody whose identity has historically been the one with the face out there as the face of the company, but also someone who is successful in a prior, identity.
Yeah.
Who was scared that I was going to fail in a completely new habitat, a tech company which I'd not experienced in. I was twice the average age of the average employee there. Long story short is my dad said to me, I said to him, I feel like I'm carrying 180 pounds on my back. And I did not have a backpack on. And clearly that 180 pounds was me. That's how much I weigh. And it was all of my identities. It was my past identities that I was trying to actually carry with me. And my dad said to me, why don't you actually just edit some of those identities? And why don't you turn your fear into curiosity and just figure out what you can learn? And that was when I realized, what if I was the person in the room who asked all the questions instead of had to have all the answers? And that shifted me into this place where I was the one who wasn't trying to pretend what I knew. I was very open to intern publicly and mentor privately, which basically means being willing to actually help people sort of behind the scenes, because nobody wants to be in the middle of a meeting, have someone the age of their father say, hey, you said that wrong. But the idea that I help support people, but the thing that was most interesting was people that you are the catalytically curious person in the room, because you're not asking the what and how questions, you're asking the why and what if questions. And these are the questions that 4-year-olds ask. And they were the questions that helped us to see some of our blind spots, because I was surrounded by a lot of really smart people who'd worked in the Googles and Apples and Facebooks in the world, and I've been attracted to Airbnb because Airbnb became the #1 place anybody wanted to work for a while there, and maybe still on some level. And the bottom line was, I just started becoming the person who acted like I was the dumbest person in the room. But what worked was I occasionally would say something and there would be silence. Sometimes it would be silence because it was like, I can't believe he just said that. He doesn't understand what it means to ship a feature. No, I don't know what it means to ship a feature. But I realized after a while that some of my lingo and tech questions I could ask one-on-one to people rather than bring it up in a meeting and slow down the meeting. But sometimes I asked questions where people say, wow, we'd never thought of it that way. And it was sort of like, wow, we have a huge blind spot on that. And that's where I realized that my value as this modern elder and bringing my wisdom to match the brilliance of these young tech wizards was where I could be very helpful. And, some of my skills that I built over many decades of emotional intelligence and leadership and
Mm-hmm.
strategy and literally holistic thinking, which is a part. The older you get, your brain gets better at holistic thinking. It gets much worse at memory and a variety of other things, speed, but it's better at synthetic holistic thinking. And so that allowed me, and that's why Brian said, a few weeks into it, like, you're the head of global hospitality, but now you're the head of strategy too, because your mind thinks differently than our minds do. And
that's
that was
awesome. Yeah. So what I'd love to in our kind of final section, I want to ask you about another place that you've been a modern elder. Development over the years have all been through there. So a storied place, but some potentially set in its ways and potentially a few decades behind the vicissitudes and shifts and changes of the market. Burning Man organization, a little bit more punk rock, a little bit less hippie, but certainly, and hosting this wild ass, volatile, 1 week only experiment in the desert. So structurally, two very different organizations, but thematically, as far as the two sort of arguable hotbeds of personal growth and transformation over the last half century, Chip, you've been at the center of both of those, serving as a board member. So, what is the pigs committed, the chickens invested? What is it? Is it on breakfast, right? I think you might have been invested, not committed on these guys. But what's been your experience helping preside over, helping nudge and steer the ground zero organizations whose business is transformation? And how have you helped them strike those balances?
Well, thank you. It's not always been easy, but I will say, and frankly, when people say Burning Man has a board, it seems like it's an organization, and frankly, Eslen's sort of the same way. So being on the board of both organizations is strange. But both, my peak model, the idea of Abe Maslow's the hierarchy of needs applied to organizations, have worked in both situations. You have very purpose-driven, meaning-driven employees, but they need to have sometimes their base needs met better. Because, people who work in nonprofits, both organizations are nonprofits now, not used to be a nonprofit. We helped to turn it into a nonprofit. A lot of times people in a nonprofit are frankly getting their meaning needs met, but they're not getting their money or their recognition needs met. So I think we've done some good things to actually try to improve on that. But I think more than anything, it's creating the environment where people are learning how to align around some moonshots and some big ideas. In the case of Burning Man, it was acquiring Fly Ranch, which is 3,500 acres, I believe it is, about 10 miles from Black Rock City, which is where the Burning Man event happens every year. In late summer. And Fly Ranch is a place that can be a long-term, not a singular, 10-day event or week-long event each year, but it's actually a place where we could do things long-term and we could try a lot of things. We could try sort of unique, new ways of thinking in almost a utopian community. And so I led the charge to have us buy that and go out and raise money from a lot of the most famous tech wizards or tech, entrepreneurs in the Valley, as well as others, to help create a place where we could try something that would be legacy oriented, not just sort of in the moment as a festival can be. Mm-hmm. And I think Burning Man, I was the first person to go out and raise money to basically rebuild the lodge and to start the process of a campus renewal program, because having a personal growth retreat center that is literally overlooking the cliffs of Big Sur, but with all that salt air in the ocean, I mean, these buildings are falling apart. And what a great location, but the physical plant was falling apart. So some of it, that was, again, base of the pyramid kind of stuff. Hey, we could be into transformation, but if our buildings are disintegrating, not a good thing. So
Well, and talk about the blowback. Let's get into some of the edges here, because I remember when you joined Eslen's board. Because we've been teaching there for over a decade, and our kids grew up there. Like we've got lots of roots in that place too. And I remember hearing both relief, finally, someone with an open heart who's also an operator, and then also the predictable kind of hippie backlash of like, capitalist pigs coming in and ruining the thing we love.
It's become a corporate spa now, and
exactly. And I'm sure you read that New York Times article whenever it was 6 months ago, And the new CEO of Esalen, and it is full bore, like, hey, unplug from your phones. They're shamelessly targeting Silicon Valley, tech execs. There's been a full pivot. So where were you in helping that transition? What do you think is tracking right? What is necessary in reinvention? What is maybe a bridge too far? What's your sense of that?
I mean, I think for me, I've first off, in order for me to operate well with either organization or any of the other, I've been on, probably 15 different nonprofit boards. You got to get your ego out of it, first and foremost. And you're serving something bigger than you. And if there's blowback, and as there has been occasionally when I've joined a board, because there's some of the boards I'm on are pretty radical boards. And I'm a pretty radical guy in the context of a Stanford MBA, but yeah, I am, I'm definitely more conventional than a lot of the people. I think what people have found on the board and many people in the communities that we serve is that I'm actually I am a radical thinker. I like different, unusual ideas. I don't really want to do things conventionally. I'm not a parliamentarian. I'm not somebody who wants to sit on the board because I want to read the notes from the meeting. I want to think big thoughts that can be transformational for our communities and for the world. So that's the way I go at it. And that's helpful. Are things sometimes, do things sometimes go off the rails? Yes, of course. I'd say in terms of Esalen, Esalen's a harder one. One of the hardest things about Esalen is it is a community. It's an intentional community. And there are very few businesses out there in the world that have their core employees, or all of their employees virtually, living with them. So you have a place that's in an isolated location, and it's a beautiful place, and it's a beautiful community. But everybody, not everybody, most of the people who actually work at Esalen live at Esalen or at the South Coast Center nearby. And so if you think about it, a person comes to Esalen often to deal with sometimes personal growth issues or things from childhood. Maybe they hated their parents. Now they've come to a place where they're living all of their housing needs, all their food needs, all their education needs, all their social needs are being met by the organization in almost like an island-like environment. It's like they've gone back and they're the child, and the parent is the board and the leadership team of Esalen. And that parent-child dynamic on both sides, in terms of how the board sometimes and leadership treats the community like children, and the children act like children, that's been an ongoing issue way, way, way before I ever joined the board. The good news is I think there's been some progress on that in the last 2 years, 2 or 3 years. But it's like anything. Esalen is a noble experiment, and a noble experiment is another way to describe failure. So Esalen is not a failure by any stretch of the imagination. But are there failures when you work in an organization that is going to experiment? Absolutely.
Yeah. So final question, and I'd actually like to ask this both to you and to everybody listening with us. So please feel free to write your responses in the chat bar, and we'll take a look at some of those, and then Chip, I'll ask you live, which is, if you could bottle just all of the lightning that you've ever found, seen, glimpsed, and bring it back undiluted, undistracted, undiverted, what would be the one most significant thing that would change in your world? So take the highest heights you've ever seen, felt, or experienced, and be able to bring it absolutely through into whatever your life and work look like now. What would be different?
Having a dog.
Having a dog. Great. And you feel free to keep riffing on that. Randy, tell you what, guys, my bad. You guys have been ripping along in the chat bar this whole time, and I didn't click on it. So I am getting to see all of these things now. Fantastic. Okay, you guys are doing great stuff. Okay, so yeah, feel free to put in your comments in the chat. I will actually, this is one of those things that continues to scroll, I believe. There we go. Yes. So Matthew was just saying ego deflation. He would have a greater willingness to change. Feel free to kind of keep just put in some answers, which is like, if you had the ability, because the whole theme of tonight has been that it's sometimes tricky. There's some voltage drop. between what we experience personally in our own development and our own insights and our own cultivating or courting of ecstasis and bring it into lives and work. And so the key here is what would you do? What would be the thing that you would sort of, if you had the magic wand, the genie lamp, what would you do and how would your life or work be different from that? Because as you guys are kind of coming in with some of these thoughts, also want to introduce the part of the reason that we got to host Chip tonight, have this kind of conversation, and we're going to be doing an ongoing series of these, is to share and expose the ideas for our new online course, which is Flow for Leaders. And the whole premise of that is translating transformation. How do we create the scaffolding? And Chip is actually, and again, a modern elder, that is not a, I don't think that's just a light title, because between peak and emotional equations, two of Chip's past books in particular, he's been tackling this exact thing, which is how do you create the scaffolded experiences, basically the kind of the training wheels that lift and support large numbers of people to raise the level of their game without forcing them to change and grow the way you did. Because that's obviously one of the biggest trade-offs. And in fact, a mentor of mine once called, he said, Jamie, one of the biggest things you got to be aware of is therapeutic aggression, right? Which is change, damn it, right? I need you to change so that you can do the thing I'm desperate to do myself. And so Janice was just saying, if she could bottle that lightning, it would be no second guessing and flow with what's coming through you. Marcus was saying, I think bigger, start smaller and iterate. Bill was saying, incorporate some heart rate variability training for communication. Valerie saying, create more intentional spaces in work, flow for reflection. Mark was talking about focusing on the social field. So really cultivating the conditions that Chip was talking about earlier of like, how do you create workplace environments where more flow and collaboration can happen? Brandon saying, removing all fears, being cautious, but never saying I can't. Okay, we can do anything with the change. And Kevin saying you could reach more people. Fantastic. So an awesome quick selection. For anybody that is interested, feel free to check out the Flow for Leaders link. It'll be there in your chat bar. When are we kicking that off? I think we're kicking that off in the beginning of August. It's going to be live once a week. And basically you have to be a leader. You have to be responsible for 3 or more people in your life or work. I mean, certainly if you are leading a family, but you care about this content, totally fine. But in general, it will be people that are working in teams, working in organizations, and they care about this stuff. And it's basically, in a nutshell, how to deal with the personal elements. So this is the top 10 tools, models, and virus scans that help do the things we've been talking about today. And it's basically the personal, how can I check myself, the interpersonal, relational, conversational, and then the strategic. How do we also make better decisions? And the goal is introduce a model, see one, do one, teach one, just like med school. You introduce a model, we talk about it as a group, you go and do it in the real world, and then you come back and rinse, wash, and repeat for 6 weeks. So super fun, and it's also the boiled down best of most durable things we've come across in the last decade of doing this with organizations. So no point teaching fancy pants shit that doesn't survive first contact with the enemy. So if that's up your alley, feel free to check it out. And in the meantime, also be sure to check out, go on Amazon right now, look up the Wisdom at Work, The Makings of a Modern Elder. This is Chip's new book. You won't be able to get it yet, but you can pre-order it so it'll show up on your doorstep. And Chip, just want to thank you again. I'm super stoked, by the way. If I get
here's my son.
Oh, and you've got a dog. We both got dogs.
Come here. This is Eli. Hey, there you go.
Yeah.
That's Eli.
Hey, buddy. How are you?
Great. Thank you. It was great to hang out with you and all of your team. And
we've got a date. We've got a date when you move out to Austin, man. It'll be fun.
Okay. All right. Great to see you. Bye.
Be well, everybody. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Bye.